In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how to utilize the UV pass within Nuke. So I'm going to jump into File, Open, jump into our project root, Nuke, and then jump into Chapter 7, UV pass Start. So I'm going to set our project directory by hitting S over the node graph, copy and paste our project directory, and just get rid of the Nuke directory to set our project root. And that'll relink up our renders. And then I'm just going to set our knob defaults. And then to start utilizing the UV pass, I'm just going to drop in a shuffle node and then plug that into a render. And then we're going to shuffle out our UV pass, just like that. And the node that we use to map on a texture is called the STMap node. And I'm just going to drop in a checkerboard for our texture. So our UV coordinates are going into our STMap, and then source goes into our texture. And if we jump into the STMap node, and then we jump into UV channels, we jump into RGBA, just like that. And then if we view our STMap node, you notice that we get our texture information mapped on. So now we can start doing things like adjust our checkerboard just like this, and you notice it all gets mapped on correctly. And then I'm just going to remove our centerline width, just like that. And then to combine this into our scene, I'm going to bring in our beauty rebuild. So I'm going to select our utility passes, going to insert comp nodes, and then I'm going to go to presets, and then beauty rebuild hybrid. And then what we can do is if we come down to our diffuse pass, what we can do is start layering in this checkerboard here. So after our raw lighting, and then in between our diffuse and our multiplication of our raw lighting. So I'm going to move this up by hitting Control, left click and drag, and then bring our STMap down, just like that. And then plug in our UV coordinates again, just like that. And if we want to replace it just where the checkerboard lives, what we can do is shuffle out our RGB map. And then we'll shuffle out our RGB mat underscore background. And then we'll take our green channel. So what I'm going to do is shuffle green into all the channels, just like that. And then if I drop in a merge by hitting M, we'll do A over B. So our STMap's going over our diffuse. And then what we're going to do is grab the mask channel and plug our mask into the RGB mat that we built. And then I'm going to take our multiply and multiply that with our newly created diffuse pass, which is this, and then multiply that in there. And then if I go all the way down the tree, you notice that we're getting our specular and reflection information back in as well. So with that said, this is a pretty extreme shift, right? In my experience, you don't really want to utilize these passes to do major changes like this. You want to do changes that essentially take the quality of your image from that 80% range to 100% range. That last 20% is incredibly difficult to do within a 3D environment, and it's much easier to achieve those kind of things within Nuke. So if we jump in here and we zoom in here, we're going to talk about this thing called filtering, which is the reason why we're getting these artifacting here. We're going to talk about this in a later lesson, but to give you a broad overview of what filtering is essentially the combination of filters. And essentially what's happening right now is our UV pass is telling our UV coordinates, instead of doing this pixel value, which is this geometry, it's doing a combination between the back plane and this teapot. So it's going somewhere in between. So it doesn't actually know where to put it, which is causing this artifacting that's happening here. There's pros and cons to rendering your utility passes with filtering on and off, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, just know that this is the utility pass that I tend to use most in production. There's pros and cons, again, with filtered and non-filtered utility passes, but in my experience, with non-filtered utility passes, you run into far more issues than what you do with utility passes. So with that said, you're going to get artifacting regardless whether you use filtering or non-filtered UV passes or render elements, utility passes rather. So instead of using this checkerboard to completely replace this, what we're going to do is just do something like a grunge pass. So I'm going to drop in a noise, just like that, and then I'm going to scale this down to something like this, and then just drop in a grade by hitting G and then multiplying up. by 2. And then we'll plug that into our ST map. And now we're getting a grunge map going all the way over scene. And if we jump back into our noise, we have our XY size that we can play with just like this, which will scale up our noise just like that. And then if we go to our over, you notice we're completely replacing it again. But if we set this to a multiply, it'll just multiply in our grunge map. And then what we can do is just come in here and play with our mix on our merge to add in subtle variations to that. So grabbing things like grunge textures and doing the same workflow, using the noise pass isn't really the best thing to be using here. I would grab like a nice grunge texture map. If you're doing like a metallic shader, grab something that's relevant for that shader. And then if we jump into our multiply by our lighting information, you'll notice that that all gets in there like that. And if we jump back down to our beauty rebuild, that adds in our specular reflection and everything, you notice we're getting much, much better results now. So keeping these things subtle is very, very powerful. Completely rechanging the texture is not ideal. So it's really important just to think about it is get as far as you can in 3D, get it to 80-90% range, and then take it that last 10 to 20% range within Nuke. And in the next lesson, what we're going to do is talk about how to utilize the point position pass.